You and I have to look at this and understand this, that the ballot is as powerful as the bullet.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Hi, welcome to episode 72 of Only Human. This is the podcast where we grow where we are with the resources at hand. We don't need any Ozempic, no Relaxium, or any other of those things that the commercials try to sell me every night when I'm watching late night TV. Nope, here we try to give you some actual ideas, thoughts, techniques, tips, and tools that you can use to grow better and stronger where you're at. So today, I want to start with a quote from one of my favorite action heroes of all time, Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee said, "The successful warrior is the average man with laser-like focus." Laser-like focus. So, hey, I'd want to be a successful warrior, and that sounds like it's not too hard. Well, laser-like focus turns out to be extremely hard. In fact, it's something that's sought after by elite military people, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, those kind of guys, top-tier athletes, surgeons, pilots. All of us search for that pure focus so that we can handle any threat when it arises. Here's the problem. We live in an era of endless distractions, right? Have you ever felt like your attention span is shrinking? Like you're being pulled in a thousand directions? If you have, you're not alone. Because I certainly have, and I feel that way a little bit right now. There's always so much going on, man. There's social events, there's political things going on, there's financial things going on, there's the daily routine, there's work, there's family, there's just so much stuff. And probably my best recent personal story is every year, 2 or 3 times a year, my son asks me to help him coach Little League, where my grandson plays. And I always say yes, because it's a priority for me. And each year, I try to get a little bit better at making sure I block off the time and protect my schedule so I can do that. And this is like the, 4th or 5th year we've been doing it. And I find this has been the toughest year. Even after I've pre-planned the blocked out time and schedule in order to do it. Well, how's that happen? It happens because of all of these different distractions that come at us, taking away our time, taking away our attention. So today, we're going to talk about focus. It comes around a lot of different words. You're going to hear about attention management, distraction management, all around this really central concept of what we pay attention to. So here's insight number 1. Attention is like a small keyhole, right? There's only so many things that can come into our brains, our minds, and be attended to at any given time. It's a small number. It's 2, 3, 4, things like that. Couple that with our short-term holding capacity, which might be a little bit more than that. And you can see that with everything going on around us, what we pay attention to at any given moment is hugely important. It's important to our work. It's also important to our survival. When we don't pay attention when we drive, when we don't pay attention to what our family members are saying, all of those things can have really nonlinear consequences, right? So let's see if we can frame this problem a little bit before we get into it too much further. And I pulled some of this stuff off the internet. Some of this is a little bit dated research, but this one's from 2022. It says, this is from a company called Asurion. I don't know exactly who they are, but they produced a study that said the average person checks their phone how many times a day? What do you think? 50? 70? More? It turns out that their study showed the average person checks their phone 96 times a day. 96 times a day. That's a lot, right? And this has given rise to some really interesting stuff in the psychological literature about attention. There's a term out there called continuous partial attention. What does that mean? Continuous partial attention means that we're attending to a lot of things, but very, very seldom one thing, right? And that term's coined by a researcher named Linda Stone. We're always scanning, right? Left, right, up, down, never really present. Right? And that's given rise to a lot of this mindfulness training, be present in the moment, be here now, all really good advice. Today, I want to get into some practical things that we can do to manage our attention all the time, but also most critically when it matters most. And I came to this topic for this week because I finally got a chance to listen to the air traffic control tapes from the near collision that happened at Midway Airport last week, a couple weeks ago now, when a regional business jet crossed an active runway, resulting in Southwest Airlines having to execute a go-around. As I listened to the ATC tapes, it was clear that air traffic control had instructed not once but twice for that business jet to hold short of the runway. And those calls, those directions were responded to. So what does that tell us? That they heard it, they responded, and they taxied across the runway anyway. Well, they clearly had some degree of lost situational awareness. But I also think this was something that I call, if you remember back to discussion on errors a few podcasts back, I call a low signal to noise ratio error. And what that means is the signal is the radio call coming from the tower that says, hey, hold short of the runway. And the noise is everything else that's going on around them. Maybe they're looking at charts. Maybe they recently had a runway change and they're trying to taxi to the other end of the runway. Who knows? We'll find out all that stuff in the investigation. But you can speculate that there was a lot going on beyond paying attention to exactly what they should have been paying attention to. So as we kind of broaden this out and say, well, okay, these are professional pilots. They are trained to do that. I would go as far to say they're nominally trained, obviously, to respond to required radio calls and to follow the rules of the road, so to speak. But none of us are really trained to deal with this, as Linda Stone calls it, continuous partial attention. So I want to throw a couple of quotes in here along the way. This one I kind of like because it's like agitated water. Lao Tzu says, your mind is like water. When it's agitated, it becomes very difficult to see through it. But if you allow it to settle, it all becomes clear. Okay? So how do we go about allowing our minds to settle? And there's different tools and techniques that we'll talk about, but most importantly is the overarching notion of being present in the moment, right? Right now, I am attempting to be present in my podcast moment, all the while knowing I have a lot of things going on around me, a lot of things I have to do yet today. So why does focus matter so much? When we seem to be going through life, checking our cell phones 96 times a day, doing okay with this continuous partial attention, because sometimes it really matters what we're paying attention to. And I mentioned a couple of things already. When we're driving, when we're having a conversation, and if we're in high-risk industries like air traffic controllers, surgeons, pilots, firefighters, cops, military operators, lives depend on your focus, right? Looking through the research and preparing for this podcast, I found a couple of different studies that look at average people people who aren't air traffic controllers, surgeons, elite military operators, etc. And it said somebody who is doing something who gets pulled away from it and then comes back, it takes them 23 minutes and 15 seconds to refocus to the level that they were at when they were distracted. Now, this is a laboratory experiment when they're doing some complex work and they get called away and they have to come back and reorient to the complex work. But that stunned me. 23 minutes and 15 seconds just to get back to where I was, mind-boggling. So you get this idea that switching attention comes at a cost, right? There's a famous study from the FAA, it's probably 20 years ago now, that they call rule activation stage. And what that means is when you're thinking about one thing and you get pulled off to think at another, have to deal with something else, there is a time that your brain uses just to switch, right? And I can't remember, but it's a relatively short period of time if you're switching between two things, a part of a second, right? I think a decent part of a second. If I guessed 0.7, I'd probably be close to switch. Now, when you add a third thing into your cross-check, that doubles, right? And by the time you have four things that you're paying attention to in this continuous partial attention loop, your brain is doing as much time switching between one thing and another and actually paying attention to any one of the four things. So your brain, by definition, has become half as effective by adding these multitasks to your challenge. Daniel Kahneman, a real famous psychologist, he wrote a really good book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, basically explains this. And he says the brain's got really limited bandwidth. And every distraction drains from it, right? So if you can only deal with so much, and each time you get distracted, you have to come back, that's that rule activation stage that takes, I don't know, whatever, point something of a second. So focus on one thing is really important. Focusing on two things, okay, yeah, we can probably get away with it. If we really start trying to pay attention to everything, we're paying attention to nothing, right? So I'd like to kind of go back to this whole idea, the historical perspective, I guess, of what focus means. Winston Churchill, one of my big favorite guys in history, actually wrote 43 books during the World War II era, leading up to it and shortly thereafter. 43 books while leading a nation at war and smoking all those great cigars. And he attributed his productivity in not just in writing, but in running the country and leading a war and holding a country together to his deep focus. When he stopped leading the country, he would write. And that took his mind off some of the things that were pressing upon him, just completely deeply into whatever he was writing. And then when it came time to drop that, he cleanly let it go and moved back to something else. Here's the key. He would spend significant amounts of time once he had his focus achieved. Sometimes 35 or 40 minutes, sometimes an hour, sometimes 2 hours, but never just a couple of minutes like we seem to do so much today. So there's a little bit of a lesson in there for us, and it's one that some of us that have been, trained to fly fast jets, we get this idea of intention control or attention control. We know, for example, that we have to keep our mind focused on the nearest threat. Maybe that's the ground, right? Maybe it's something else. But at the same time, in our periphery, be monitoring a lot of other things so we know when we should shift our deep focus to another one thing, right? That takes practice. That takes a lot of practice. But once you understand and you can manipulate your mind that way, a term called metacognition that we've talked about before, everything becomes much easier. We get a lot more productive and a lot more done. So let's flip it now and talk a little bit about what prevents that and how distractions hijack our brain. Right? We've talked about this before too. Social media, all of our cell phone notifications. And I turn this off most of the time before I start the podcast because it's going to ring and buzz and beep several times per hour. Many of us, including myself, become like Pavlov's dogs. The phone buzzes. What is it, right? So we got to find a way to manage that. And between social media and all of the text type communications, it creates a constant state of what psychologists call novelty, right? Here I was typing on this or doing my podcast, and oh, what a surprise! I've got a message. I've got a notification. Somebody liked my Facebook post, right? And that creates dopamine addiction. And dopamine addiction is kind of a loop, right? We get excited. We look at something. Oh, isn't that interesting? I'm not doing that boring thing anymore I was focusing on. And then I come back to the boring thing and I crave that next dopamine hit. So that's the whole attention economy gig right there, right? What we want to become, if possible, and I love this term, but I don't say it very well, is indistractable, right? And indistractable, it's actually a title of a book by somebody called Nireyal, Nireyals. Nireyal. They point out in that book that being indistractable isn't about shutting out distractions. It's about learning to pay attention to what matters. And when you're doing that and you feel good about doing that, you build your own dopamine loop based on attention, not based on distraction. So a pretty cool little trick, right? The problem is, as we've come to be addicted to our cell phones, our computers, and all these other things going on around us, we buy into this myth of multitasking, right? Multitaskers, and there have been tons of studies done on it, they lose quality on all tasks, right? When they focus on more than one thing at a time. Multitaskers lose quality on all tasks when they try to focus on more than one thing at a time. You can do two things at once, but you can't do them well because you can't focus effectively on two things at once. Okay, so what can we do about it, right? And here's the little part that I usually get some feedback on and say, that was really helpful, Tony. So practical tips and techniques to master attention. The first one is something called the Eisenhower Matrix. We've talked about this one maybe a year ago. Eisenhower developed a way to discriminate between urgent tasks and important tasks, right? Urgent tasks mean I have to deal with it right now. Important tasks say these have more impact. By understanding what tasks were urgent and what tasks were important, he was able to guide his entire staff. This was a combat staff when he started it. He rolled this all the way into the White House on doing the important things and giving other people the task or delegating the urgent things, right? So Eisenhower Matrix says, weigh the difference between urgency and importance and focus on things that are important. When you get a little bored with those or you're getting burnt out, go to the urgent things, knock them out as quick as you can, right? Then there's one out there I came across just doing research for this podcast. I'd heard about it before, but I've never really tried it. I'm going to try it. It's called the Pomodoro technique. The Pomodoro technique is basically a 25-minute deep work sprint, right? I have a chapter to write in my new book. Right? I haven't been able to get to it in 2 days, but today I'm going to try a Pomodoro technique. I'm going to set my stopwatch, click on it, and I'm going to work hard until the beep goes off 25 minutes later, see how it goes. But it does allow you, through sort of a gamified way, to pay deep attention to one thing, at least for about a half hour. Here's one, it comes from a guy named Mel Robbins. It's called the 5-second rule. Now, I have a 5-second rule in my house, but it's more about picking up that piece of shrimp you dropped on the floor before the dog gets it. No, this 5-second rule is actually pretty cool. If I had named this, which I didn't, I would have called it the 5-second countdown, right? And it's an anti-procrastination tool. The rule's pretty straightforward. The moment you have an instinct to act on something, you start the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you act. No matter what it is, right? You get up in the middle, you look over, it's 6:30 in the morning, you know it's time to get up, but you don't feel like it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you roll out of bed, right? It's really science-based, because after about 10 seconds, your brain by default will try to talk you out of anything you don't want to do, right? Whether that's start a difficult task, speak up in a meeting, get out of bed, whatever it is, right? So by starting this little countdown automatically of having this technique, when you hit 0, launch, you do something. Your brain doesn't have time to kill the idea. Your momentum takes over, right? It breaks this habit loop of saying, I really don't want to get up, or if I speak up, people are liable to take me out of context, or whatever it is. It develops an action bias, and that's what we want. Our focus is driven by a bias for action. The first small movement makes follow-through, and the focus on the follow-through far easier and more likely, right? So try that one. It's called the 5-second rule. I call it the 5-second countdown. Once you have an impulse to act on something, you got to do it within 5 seconds, because 5 seconds later, your brain's going to kill it, right? Next technique. This is more of a mindset thing than it is a technique, but think of your attention as a muscle, right? We lift weights, we stretch, we do things to take care of our muscles. But attention really is just like a muscle. It has to be exercised. And not just like we always do. You say, well, I'm exercising a lot. I got 20 things going on right now. That's not exercising it. That's lazy attention. By doing some of these techniques, by focusing in, by shifting your focus, by reminding yourself that when you get an impulse, you need to act, you're going to be able to grow your capacity to manage your attention, right? Like I mentioned earlier, elite athletes, jet pilots, surgeons, they train to do this. And the way we train is by learning to pay attention to the one thing that is most important now, while peripherally observing everything else that matters. And once we peripherally observe something that matters more than the one thing we're looking at now, we switch with full focus, right? Fancy term for it is cross-check that we use in the cockpit. That's not myopia where you're just looking through a tunnel. It's just full mental and physical focus on the one thing that matters the most right now, right? So when you can do that and you're practicing those types of things, practicing a reasonable 2, 3, 4 element cross-check, but able to focus on the one thing that matters right now, you're building the muscles of your attention, right? A couple of other techniques that I've heard about and read about is this one comes from one of those Navy SEALs that wrote a book, and it says, "Win the first battle of the day." Right? Win the first battle of the day. So you know you've got something to do, whether it's make the bed, get your workout in, do your meditation, take your vitamins, make your coffee, whatever it is. Do that with full focus, right? If you start your day out with full focus, you'll never have one of those cloudy, foggy days where you look back and you can't even remember where you were that morning. So I really like that one. Win the first battle of the day with full focus, no matter what that is. Then this one's obvious. Eliminate digital distractions. Right? Turn the notifications off. Right? Turn these damn things off when you go to bed, or at least full to silent. I have a couple of buttons on my phone here where I get no notifications. I call those focus hours, deep focus hours. And I tell people that need to get a hold of me, if you need to get a hold of me during a focus hour, I'm probably on my computer. Send me an email, hit me on Teams. And I know you're saying, how can you focus if you do that? Because this thing will interrupt me 20 times more than my computer ever will, right? I tell my wife, if you need to get a hold of me, you're going to have to come up here and knock on my office door, right? And then after my focus hour is done, I reconnect, tell everybody, hey, I'm back up. Okay? That concept right there is deeply described in a book by Cal Newport called Deep Work. And Cal says that the ability to focus in today's environment is a superpower. And I believe him. It really seems that way to me. And as much as I used to be laser focused, and I trained to be laser focused as a fast jet pilot, and then as an author that spent hours working on things in one sitting. The longer I live and the older I get, the more and more difficult that gets. So I'm reinitiating my war on inattention. So I want to wrap this whole thing together with a couple of thoughts. First of all, focus isn't about doing more. It's about doing more that's important to you with deep intent, right? You won't necessarily get more done. You might, but the stuff you do get done, you'll do much better, right? Much, much better. Stephen Covey, who I love to quote, didn't realize how right he was with this simple sentence. He said, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Right? And that if he would have added for significant duration until that main thing no longer needs to be the main thing, it would have been perfect. So here's my challenge to you on this as we wrap this up. Just for the next 24 hours, one day, think about the one thing that's most important to you, right? Try one of those techniques. Try the win the first battle of the day, and then get on the task of doing that one thing that's most important to you. Give that, for at least an hour, your full attention. Or if that's too much, if an hour is too much, and for some of you it is because, oh my gosh, my phone's beeping and I've got to do this, I got to do that. Try the Pomodoro technique of 25 minutes. Deep dive, no distractions, no multitasking. Just see what happens when you try that. I think once you understand what true focus feels like, again, it's going to take on a life of its own. You'll get that flywheel of attention and focus going for you, and I think you'll be better because of it. So until next time, like always, keep getting better where you are with the resources at hand. Stay focused in doing that, and we will see you soon.